First of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's such an honor. I love being in rooms with people in industries because you guys know more than scholars, frankly. In this room, there's enough knowledge to write 1,000 books. So I'm humbled to be here, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about my book, Worn, which tells a story about the history of clothing. Obviously, you can't tell the history of clothing in one book. It's like telling the history of the world in one book, but I'm going to talk about 5 materials that are kind of crucial to understanding the clothing that we wear and kind of where we come from. So I'm going to start by sharing a little personal history. This is me as a 17-year-old, and I don't know if you can tell this from where you're sitting, but I'm wearing a dress made out of newspaper. And I was basically a very polemical teenager, and at a certain point decided, why are we wearing clothing made of cloth? That's stupid. We should be wearing clothing made of other stuff. And somehow convinced my group of girlfriends to go to a New Year's party wearing clothing entirely made of paper. And it was a really, really fun project. However, as soon as we got out of the car, like, you can imagine how embarrassing it was as soon as we got to the party. Drinking, dancing, and like by the end of the party, we were basically naked. And this experience gave me a great respect for cloth. And that is the subject of my book and the subject of my talk today. And I know it's sort of so obvious to say, it almost doesn't need saying, but I think there's a lot of people out there for whom the idea that clothing is always made of cloth is not very intuitive. And for me, growing up in a kind of post-industrial economy, I wasn't surrounded by images of textile making or even growing the crops from which textiles come. So it took a while to get back to the root of things, which is essentially animals, plants, and petroleum. We'll see that in the coming presentation. I'm going to start with linen. Linen is, well, not linen per se, but plants that have bast fiber form some of the oldest textiles on the archaeological record. The first fully intact item of clothing we have in that record is this shirt, which is about 5,000 years old. It was discovered in a tomb in Egypt. One of the interesting things about this shirt is not just how exquisitely it's made. If you can see these pleats on the shoulder, they're all pressed in so that you could go like this and be very comfortable. It's a very sophisticated and exquisite garment, but the story of its discovery is also really interesting to me. So this was found by a British archaeologist in 1912, and he was kind of going through looting the tomb or doing research, whatever you want to call it. And he saw this and was like, funerary rag, and kind of chucked it in a bin, because at that time, a textile wasn't really very interesting to an archaeologist. He was interested in gold and metal, like more durable artifacts of that ancient civilization. So this was saved but languished in a bin in the British Museum's storage called funerary rags until the 1970s, when 2 female curators went digging through it and said, this is a shirt. This is actually the oldest shirt on the archaeological record. So I think, to me, what this story illustrates is that the history of textiles hasn't been given, I think, appropriate attention. And sometimes I think textiles and clothing are kind of consigned to the realm of the superficial, and they're sort of they're feminine, they're feminized. The work that goes into them is therefore, I think, less than acknowledged in its full capacity for what it is. As you all know in this room, it's a major global industry, and it kind of always has been a central part of human economy. Making clothing is pretty much as important as making food, and it's taken up as much time as making food historically. This is something that really started to bother me a couple of years ago. If you focus on fabric, as I'm sure everyone in this room does, weird stuff starts to bother you. And I started seeing these articles about how when you break up with someone, you should throw away your sheets. And I understand why you would want to throw away your sheets after a breakup. You want to get the smell of the person out of your life. Maybe you want to do a ritual expiation of the space. There's a lot going for throwing things out. However, what I didn't like about it is the way that it treats linens as disposable, essentially. It's like, get rid of them, buy some new ones. And specifically because there's such a historic connection between linens and marriage. And so in a lot of cultural traditions, a woman's whole job leading up to getting married would be to make her own linens, and that could take years. So it's not just the idea that things are disposable, it's the idea that we've gone from a project that takes years to something that isn't even considered labor. But somebody made these sheets, and this cotton did come from somewhere. So I think this is just a glimpse into the way in which garments have become so separated from the materials and labor that produces them that we almost don't see it. It's like, throw out the sheets. This is a sampler from colonial New England. And as you can see, somebody put a lot of time into this. And it was probably a young girl. This was a traditional way of teaching what was considered then a very important craft, which was embroidery and also literacy. But what I wanted to highlight with this image is the fact that in colonial New England, as in the entire world prior to the Industrial Revolution, making textiles was a communal act, and it was very much based on local networks. So in the New England context, flax would be planted, harvested probably by men, redded in a river, then hackled, spun, woven, probably by women. And this took the entire year. I mean, this was part of agricultural labor cycles. It was something to do in the winter. It took time, a lot of time. Now, I'm going to talk next about cotton, and I think, to me, the Industrial Revolution is a story about the transformation of the way we make textiles. And I think you can't understand the Industrial Revolution without understanding cotton, and I think you can't really understand cotton without understanding the story of imperialism. So I felt if I was going to do justice to this in my book, I really needed to dive into the whole story of the global imperial project, which is obviously too much to fit into my talk today, but I'm going to give you a little taste. I started not in India, which is where I'll go next, but in Lubbock, Texas. I was living in Wyoming at the time, and I drove down to Lubbock. Is anyone from Texas here? Okay, a couple, one. Anyways, if you've ever been to Lubbock, it's extremely flat, and they grow a lot of cotton in Texas. It's very water intensive, and it's a very chemical intensive process. These are really hardworking guys, and they make a lot of product, but the way in which it's made, to me, has really serious implications for the environment, including water withdrawal from the Ogallala Aquifer. So as I said, traditionally you'd have cotton sprinkled in the Central American context, probably with corn. In India, it would be sprinkled in with rice. And when I say sprinkled in, I mean planted in a mixed way, where textile plants and food plants are grown together and processed locally. Today, we have huge monoculture farms producing cotton in the US. I'm gonna show you next a little video of a cotton stripper, because if you've never seen one, I just think you all need to know how cotton is harvested in Texas. It's pretty fascinating. As you can see, it operates kind of like a giant vacuum cleaner. The man in the video was Edwin Lewis. He took a lot of his time to take me through Texas cotton fields, and I'm so grateful to him. He's another person who, as I said, being in this business his entire life, just had such a wealth of knowledge. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, and for many centuries, if not millennia, the major producer of cotton textiles for export in the world was not England, was not the US, but it was India. And Indian textiles were of such fine quality that they were draining the gold of Rome. And the historian Pliny argues that we've got to do something about how much Romans are spending on Indian cotton textiles because it's bad for our currency supply. Like, this is how desirable Indian cotton textiles were. So 1600, the British East India Company starts selling these textiles abroad. They become its most popular product. And eventually, as the British took power on the subcontinent, they gained political control sufficient to transform India not into a producer of textiles, but into a producer of raw cotton to feed British machines. So this is the beginning of a global trade in manufactured cotton garments that we're living in the aftermath of. I'm gonna skip a lot, but basically this is where we get chattel slavery in the US, growing massive amounts of raw cotton in the South to feed British and Northern mills, and a system where land is cleared in one place, planted with cotton to be shipped to another place. I'm skipping a lot, but that's sort of the gist of it. So I traveled to Tamil Nadu in 2018, which is a beautiful part of southern India. I went with a GIS expert named Ramesh Sivanpili, who was taking readings for a science project while we went around and visited farms and factories, and I learned a lot. What I'm about to show you, is an amazing, I think, process where these women are making a cotton bale. In Texas, this process takes like 3 minutes. I've seen it mechanized. The gin pours down the cotton, kachung, into the compactor, and it's done within minutes. In India, this takes a little while, and it's a kind of a fascinating blend of hand labor and machine labor. So I could watch the full hour of this, but I'll just play a couple of minutes, and you can see how they make a cotton bale in Tamil Nadu.
Bailing the old style.
So she's going to keep doing this. They're going to keep pouring cotton, and she's going to keep tromping it down, which is also, Edwin told me how they used to do it in Texas. He has memories as a child of, he called it tromping down the cotton. So one of the things that I want to note about this process is if you're making a bale of cotton, which is a tightly compacted way, it's a way to ship, basically. The bale is an artifact of a globalized trade network. Traditionally in India, the cotton would be ginned on a small scale and locally processed within a village. It was a major source of wealth. And after this process of the demolition of the industry by the British and the creation of a global industry, we have something that looks very, very different. Now, one of the things that you probably have all heard about, you have it written on your t-shirts that were so kindly distributed today, is that this whole process uses a ton of water. So Tamil Nadu is often without enough water, and yet massive amounts of cotton are still shipped out in the form of, water is shipped out in the form of cotton. And I have a graphic that kind of illustrates this. Oops, sorry. This is a kind of simplified version of water flows moving across the world. This is towards the United States. The next slide is towards Europe. But a lot of the times I think people, corporations mostly, tend to talk about the global supply chain like it's super complicated, you can't possibly understand it, don't think too hard about it, it's really confusing. But it's not that confusing really if you look at water flows. It's like water is moving from one part of the world to another, and I think this illustrates kind of how that works. This one is to Europe. It's a similar thing, like a very thick black line. The width of the line indicates the amount of water flowing. So it's kind of part of the work of this room. What I've heard today already is thinking seriously about kind of global inequity and how this looks in the form of water. It's one interesting framework, I think. The next part of the cotton story I'm going to tell is even darker, if that's possible. I know this is like a sort of dark section of the talk, but this is Xinjiang. You may have heard of it. It's in Western China, and it's also a dry region, also a region with a lot of sun, really good for growing cotton if you have water to irrigate it with. And for the past several decades, it's been a major source of cotton, major component of Chinese export. And disturbingly, it's come to light over the past decade or so that it's also the site of forced labor. So this is an illustration. It's not a photograph, obviously. It's a dramatic representation. There's not journalists allowed into Xinjiang. But it's come to light increasingly that there is forced labor in the supply chain in Xinjiang. There are regulations in the US and in the EU and maybe some other countries that say now quite explicitly that it is illegal to import goods made with forced labor. However, it's really hard to enforce. So this is a huge part of the history of cotton, this trouble with forced labor, but it's also part of the present reality, unfortunately. Ironically, this cotton export issue is all happening in a country that is historically known for quite another fiber, for which I'm going to turn to next, and that is silk. So silk is in some ways like the definition of luxury and fantasy, and has a really big part to play in the history of global trade and exchange, and in the history of fashion as well. These are silkworms. I don't have a video for you. I wish I did, because, well, it's a very slow video. They move very slowly. I saw these in a museum in China. Silkworms feed on mulberry leaves. That is their exclusive food. And when they make a cocoon, they create this long, when you unspool their cocoons, it is what we know as silk. Compared to linen, which arrived on the scene about 36,000 years ago, silk is a relative newcomer. It appears much more recently in the historical record, between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago. And for much of history, it existed exclusively in Asia, but it captured the imagination of the world, as we'll see. This is also something that I saw in a museum in China. It's I forget the name, it's like 500 children pattern. It's like about fecundity. During Roman times, silk traveled across Central Asia and defined the imperial court, what it meant to be well-dressed. Sericulture, which is the making of silk, began in Byzantium under Justinian and had reached the Arab world by the 9th century. The Crusades brought knowledge of silk to Western Europe, and the first mulberry tree was brought to France from Syria in 1147. This is Colbert, who was the finance minister to Louis XIV. He's kind of an interesting part of the history of textiles, because in collaboration with Louis XIV, he created the French fashion industry. And the way he did this was essentially to make it illegal, if you were an aristocrat, to buy last year's cloth. So you had to buy the new silk that was coming off the presses in Lyon, and you had to change from wearing wool and silk to, you had to change, well, velvet and silk to lighter fabrics at a certain date in the year. It was very prescriptive, but it helped produce a lot of churn for Lyon, and it helped spread French fashion all over Europe and beyond. In the United States in the 1920s, as garments increasingly started to be mass manufactured in factories, the name of the French designer became very valuable, and Paul Poiret was, has anyone here ever heard of Paul Poiret? He's such a fascinating figure. He kind of invented like the flapper look and was quite a character. There's a quote from him that always sticks in my mind. He said, "I've liberated women's torsos but shackled their legs," which just shows you the kind of guy he was. But it's like really hard to walk in those little flapper outfits. Anyways, he came to the United States in the 20s and was visiting New York, and would go into a store and see his own name on like the back of a hat. And he was just, he didn't design it. He was just being, you know, like his name was being exploited. But I think what's important to note about the 1920s is it kind of saw the birth of advertising as an industry, largely in New York City. And immediately, advertisers recognized that if you wanted to sell clothing, it was very important not to have the viewer, or the consumer rather, think about the place that it was made, aka the sweatshop, but rather think about the kind of glamorous woman that they could be while wearing it. So advertising really emphasized making the conditions of production invisible. And I think we're still living with that legacy today. I'm gonna now talk about synthetics, which are a product of kind of this period. The first major synthetic to come online was rayon, which is made of wood, but most synthetics today are made out of petroleum. It is now the number one, as I'm sure you all know from being in this trade, the most common textile ingredient in today's clothing supply chain is petroleum. This is a strike in Tennessee. These women are rayon workers. They are showing a lot of gumption here, although their strike was ultimately unsuccessful in the end, unfortunately. One of the problems with rayon production in the 1920s that continues through today, really continued in the US until the 1970s when most production was offshored, and now is still a problem in India, is that the chemical solvent that you use to break down wood pulp, called carbon disulfide, is very toxic. And so if proper ventilation isn't used in the factory, workers start hallucinating. It like profoundly affects the brain. Early on in the 1920s, people would just jump out windows, eat their socks, like really wild stuff started happening in rayon factories, and it was suppressed by industry. So this is truly like another dark chapter in thinking about worker safety or not thinking about worker safety. As I said, this strike was not successful, really. It was never possible for a variety of political reasons for textile manufacturers in the South to successfully unionize. But in the North, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was a union that represented women and men, people who made garments, were successful. And I think it's really important to take a minute to recognize the success of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, because whenever there's a factory collapse today, like the one in Dhaka that got the headlines, or even smaller ones, they happen so frequently, I think there can be a tendency in the press to look back to things like the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in 1911 and say, yeah, it's a sweatshop industry, it's always been a sweatshop industry, it always will be a sweatshop industry, and that's not true. For many decades, basically from like just before World War II through the 60s, garment making was union work, and it was good work. It came with a middle-class income, it came with healthcare, cultural opportunities. This was really raised to the status of a safe and decent line of work for people, for women predominantly, but for people. And I think it's important to register that. For me anyways, it is. This next slide has to do with nylon. Nylon was the first synthetic to be made purely out of petroleum. So rayon was wood pulp. This was DuPont creating a fiber that it could sell purely made out of petroleum. So during World War II, it was used for parachutes and war material. And after the war, women went crazy and mobbed malls trying to get their hands on a pair of nylons. I also think it's kind of sad because at the same time they were kind of being ejected from the labor force in the US. So in a way, I feel like it's a misplaced desire. They're like, I'll go fight someone over some nylons. After the defeat of Japan in World War II, the US, so Japan was occupied under General Douglas MacArthur, and one of MacArthur's first priorities was to rebuild Japanese industry. It was believed that this would help Japan not become communist. So the US State Department actually poured money into rebuilding infrastructure and textile capacity in Japan and opened its markets to Japanese cloth, which eventually helped erode and destroy the US's own textile industry. Similar efforts helped build textile capacity in Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. And in the post-war period, all of these exports would be sort of the beginning of the end of the US industry. This is Reagan. And Reagan, in the 80s, kind of operating on a similar logic that if the Caribbean basin could be made into a major garment exporter, that it could prevent countries in this region from becoming communist. So in the 80s, he initiated something called the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which basically meant that US fabric manufacturers sent fabric down to the Caribbean basin countries, and then they could re-enter the US market with no tariffs. So it's kind of like turning this whole region into an annex for manufacturing garments for the US market. The problem with that is that despite the promises that this kind of manufacture would lift areas out of poverty and create good jobs and jumpstart economies, that's not really the outcome that most economists see in retrospect. It was more a way to use cheap labor, but it didn't really bring the kind of knowledge base, equipment, and it didn't jumpstart economic growth in the way that was promised. This is an export processing zone I visited in Vietnam, or rather a factory inside. So a critical part of the story of the garment trade is the end of a system of tariffs that began in the 70s. So basically in the US and Europe, places that had developed textile and garment industries, this kind of deluge of textiles and garments from Asia caused major economic problems, and eventually there was enough pain being felt by these industries that a global system of tariffs was arranged called the multi-fiber arrangement. So this kind of made sure that the supply coming into Europe and the US was moderated somewhat. In 2005, this expired, and clothing prices in the US dropped almost by half. It was very fast. The main winner at that time was China, and consumers started buying almost twice as much. It was like clockwork. It was kind of took people even stocking the shelves at Walmart by surprise. Today, a lot of garments, as I'm sure people here know, are manufactured in export processing zones. These are small entities within a country that operate with slightly different rules. There, for instance, might be no import taxes, no export taxes. They're designed in a similar way as the Caribbean Basin Initiative to kind of create sources of cheap labor that garment manufacturers can make use of anywhere, even in a country that doesn't have, say, security or electricity infrastructure that would normally be appropriate to manufacture. The EPZs are like little mini states within the state where the electricity stays on and the political unrest stays, invisible. So they kind of operate as a way to access cheap labor anywhere. Again, economists who look at these sites often say they're not really presenting the country in which they're hosted with the economic benefits that sometimes are promised. They do provide jobs, but they often don't jumpstart the economy outside of the export processing zone. So I'm going to turn now to the last fiber, which is wool. And the reason that I'm going to end with wool is because I think it's a story that can be a little more inspiring. I'm not against any one fiber. I'm not wearing wool right now, but I've noticed that at least where I'm from, which is New England, people are interested in really small local supply chains, are often into wool. It's something that you can do on a farm. You can have a sheep, you can process the fiber yourself, you can go to a fair and trade with your friends. So it's a scene. It's totally a scene. This is my friend Luke Davis. He's actually not a wool guy, but more of a denim guy. But I got into like this kind of world of small producers through Luke. He has a company in Hartford called the Hartford Denim Company. If you're ever in Hartford, I urge you to swing by. They make wonderful jeans. They used to use Japanese denim. Now they mostly use American cotton duck. But they take textiles really seriously. They do small batch stuff. And there are people like this all over the world who are kind of focused on creating alternative, smaller, and more sustainable supply chains, and I think they're worth looking at. This is at a farm in northern Wyoming. I went there to observe the sheep shearing and ended up inoculating lambs because when you go to a sheep shearing in northern Wyoming, you need to help. And I actually really like helping. It's weird going to places and just watching other people work. I've done a lot of it while writing this book, like showing up and watching someone work is kind of weird. But Wyoming has a really storied history with sheep and wool and fabulous amounts of small makers. This is a textile made by a contemporary Navajo weaver named Marlo Katoni. I visited him in Navajo country, and I wanted to tell a story there about art. Textiles in most places throughout time are not just a way to get dressed, but they're an art form, and they always have been. And this is, I don't know if you can tell, it's like Angry Birds, the video game, but they're seated on a tree of life. So he's, as an artist, really interested in kind of like thinking about how tradition, particularly Navajo tradition, and modern technology can be brought together. This isn't his palette. This is Marlo surrounded by locally dyed wool in near his home. And this last image before I go to questions is sort of me after writing this book. So I went to something called Woolfest in northern Cumbria, which is in England, to see kind of this part of the scene of wool makers. And I was just really captivated by this sweater. It's made from Wensleydale long wool, which is a kind of wool that was worn, I was told, by English royalty back when. It's really lovingly made and it feels really heavy, and I just wanted to show you I've come a long way since the paper dress. I've come a little bit to honor the fact that people have been doing textile making for quite a long time, and there's something to be said for just trusting the traditional. So I'm going to end it there.